Hello. Many of us in Pakistan would like to believe that this country was meant to be a democratic, inclusive welfare state. But it was quickly turned into and has remained since a national security project. I'm not talking about the military dictators or the judges who validated violation of constitution during the course of our history. But we have seen that even political parties and the parliament has often passed legislation which undermines civil liberties, human rights, right to privacy, freedom of expression. And we've seen in the last couple of weeks of this government, led by the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, passing a series of legislation in haste, without transparency, and without much public discussion, which has huge implications for what we can say in this country or what we can't say, how we can be taken to task and punished. It has huge implications for ordinary citizens, for journalists, for people in news media as well. To talk about some of this legislation, I'm joined today by Farieha Aziz, a former journalist and a digital rights activist. Farieha, thank you so much for joining. I understand that not a lot of people have seen some of this legislation. Even the parliamentarians were taken by surprise. But you have looked at least two of them. One is called PEMRA, which is Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority, which regulates news channels and electronic media. And then there is another piece of legislation which has been passed by the cabinet. It hasn't yet been presented to the National Assembly, and it's called e-safety bill, electronic safety bill. Can we start by you explaining what this e-safety bill is all about?
Certainly. So, Shahzeb, none of us had actually heard of this e-safety bill until it was reported that it had been approved it had received the principal approval by the cabinet along with the data protection bill. So this is the first anybody heard of it. No draft was in circulation. At least with the data protection bill, there was an older version. We don't know which version is actually the approved version, but a version was in circulation, so we were able to comment on it. So all we were relying on was speculation in the media based on whatever. And I feel like these were sort of like these PR stance being pulled by whoever was moving the bill to push it out, saying, oh, this is going to protect people from harm, this, that, and the other. So it was only until yesterday when we saw there was a tweet by the Ministry of IT, and well, now are we calling them reposts or posts in the X era? Okay. Mm-hmm. So they put it out saying that this is the version that has received cabinet approval, and now we're putting it out for feedback. So rather than going in reverse order, that they should have put it out for feedback, what the bill was before sending it to cabinet, they're putting out the approved version. And the time frame that they've given is until Monday, August 7, which is essentially they're saying spend your weekend reading, writing, sending us the input, which they will most likely disregard anyway, but they are doing it to check a box so that before the legislative session ends, maybe 2 days later, the assemblies are dissolved, they're in a position, if they want to introduce it. That is what it seems like.
So there seems to be this astonishing sense of urgency with which the government is moving. I would be surprised if even the members of cabinet have read through the bill before approving it. Now, you have looked at it, right? What are some of the most glaring concerns for you as a digital rights activist?
So the first thing is that this is a rehash, partly, of proposals that were fielded earlier to essentially regulate OTT, right? Anything that's OTT platform. So if you have Netflix or something that's going online, so they want, and the attempt at that time was to bring this under PEMRA. But it didn't really fall under the category of PEMRA. It's not a news, it's not a channel, a licensee, etc., and all of that. The second thing.
So can I just be clear? PEMRA is only supposed to regulate news channels, TV channels, right? That's the remit. That's the jurisdiction.
So only channels and the electronic media channels, because they obtain licenses and so they become their licensees, and that is the ambit and their jurisdiction. So the challenge, and then obviously after the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, PTA was empowered to take cognizance of online content. But the thing is that is also, social media platforms are not registered here, so they can't really exercise the jurisdiction over them. So they've been trying to do that. So we've seen that in the social media rules, for instance, right? Registration requirements. In this, what you have...
Okay, I'm going to ask you to slow down a little bit. So we've talked about PEMRA, which is supposed to regulate news channels. You mentioned Pakistan Telecom Authority, which regulates, the digital sphere, right? Yeah. You mentioned the PICA Act, which is again, digital harassment, cyberbullying, fraud. And we already have some of these laws and these government bodies. And on top of that, they now want to bring in another legislation, right?
So what they want to do is, and why I'm laying out that sort of structure, is because now they want to create a superstructure of sorts, right? One authority, an overarching authority that will regulate now the online, because PTA typically has regulated as its licensees telcos and ISPs. They were given some content blocking provisions, but that didn't make social media platforms or users their licensees. Now here what they're doing is creating the superstructure, telling everybody, if you're a content creator, content providing platform, you need to register with us, become a licensee. So then we can hold you to licensing agreements, like canceling your license if we want to, which essentially means we're familiar with how PEMRA works, right? Right. Then creating this sort of overarching code of conduct of sorts, like we have with the PEMRA laws, and it's extremely vague, subjective, misapplied. And so now they want to do the same for the internet, essentially, as well. Any content that is produced.
Right. So from what I have seen, from one of the drafts that I've seen, it talks about creating an authority. And the authority is, as usual, stuffed by government functionaries. As far as I could see, it doesn't have anybody from the digital sphere, people who are experts or who want to promote, the e-commerce and things like that. Is that your reading as well?
Yes. So one, obviously, what we always complain about, the lack of independence of regulators, even though they're statutory organizations, there's federal government interference, which obviously means content, etc., directives that come to these organizations. So similarly here, the federal government is making these appointments. So it's not independent, right, at the outset. The other thing that you mentioned, so what they are also doing is housing e-commerce platforms, advertising under this as well. And I think this is something they've learned from the corporate media model. When you stifle advertising and revenue, you're able to stifle the expression. And so now essentially they're applying the same model online.
Right. So, am I right in thinking that what PEMRA has done to news channels in terms of control, in terms of stifling debate, this authority created under e-safety bill will try to regulate the cyberspace in pretty much the same manner?
This seems to be the attempt, certainly, and interestingly, because it seems that now the narrative is being employed, but PTA is not able to handle it. And so now we need yet another authority. And, we keep hearing, our courts can't do it, set up an anti-terrorism court, do this. So parallel structures, and now a superstructure on top of it, right? And again, these reflect ambitions. These are not necessarily rooted in reality of how this might work. So, but then again, some people, some constituencies are going to end up being affected more than others, and that's locally. Locally, obviously, it's going to apply immediately. Will the social media giants adhere to this? Most likely not. They've been saying about, social media rules that we're not registering, we're not bringing servers. These kinds of policies are unacceptable. So either, and we're going to isolate ourselves. So either they will withdraw services, or this authority or others will block them for us, right? Because they'll say that they haven't complied with our directives. But we stand to lose as users.
So the overarching fear seems to be, as I said earlier, that because we are a national security state, there's been a concern for many years now about how the state is unable to control the digital sphere. There's been a deep concern and paranoia about how openly the debate is taking place about commentary about politics, about our state institutions, interference in politics. Some of this legislation that we are seeing appears to be aimed at controlling that, and we are not the first country who are worried about it. I mean, look at our neighbors, Iran, India, many other authoritarian countries. They've done the same thing.
They have done the same thing. In fact, right now in India, the data protection bill has been presented, and of course, there's been a lot of criticism about the provisions and some changes, also about transparency with the opposition staging a walkout. So very similar things that are happening, and ironically, because we tend to criticize a lot of the excesses that take place there, but then we replicate the same sort of behavior over here, whether it's pushing legislation through parliament or how communities are treated, etc. So here, and again, various legislations are peppered with similar kinds of clauses, which shows you that control mindset, that security mindset, and also the punitive mindedness with the laws. In terms of levying fines, they want to be able to, an arbitrary discretionary fines which run into the millions.
Yeah.
And then also by burying you in bureaucratic process. So in the e-safety as well, in terms of what they've laid out, that there's a commission and there's a tribunal, and they also want to bar, interestingly, civil courts and any other forum and entity is not going to be able to take any sort of cognizance of actions. So you're exempting the authority for its excesses. Sure, there's a high court appeal, but by the time you make it to the high court, you've been buried in the process, and it could take any amount of time. And typically what tends to happen is that you can't then jump right to the high court, because the high court will say, well, as per the law, you've been given a right of various platforms where you can raise your grievance. But by the time, and these are going to be time sensitive grievances, if your platform is held hostage and you have content and there's something that you need to put out, days and months are going to really, really impact you and can also shut you down.
So the government can say that, look, there has been a lot of cyber fraud, and there's cyber bullying and harassment. It's destroying lives, and we need to act. Similar arguments were used, if you remember, when they were trying to introduce the cyber crime law. Can you highlight, how the stated intention and how the practice of the law has been diametrically opposed to the stated objective?
Absolutely. And the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act is a good example, and it's not so far back in history, right, that any of this has happened. So 2016, at that time, the narrative that was employed was that, one, we have a terrorism problem, and so National Action Plan and hate speech and terrorist content. And then on the other hand, was flagged that, women get harassed online, and so we need to provide a remedy. So at that time, many people bought into that narrative because, one, we didn't have a law at all. But now that's not the case, because you've seen how the law was introduced, what narrative and to what effect it's been used. So women who have been harassed often complain that they don't hear back, or when their cases are not prioritized, or their files are lost, or the prosecution is not serious. So we see all of these host of issues. On the other hand, we see that when it's about curbing political dissent and targeting journalists or dissidents, those cases move very swiftly. The arrests are made, cases are registered, cyber terrorism accusations and sections are leveled. And then, one of the governments always come back with, but there are safeguards, right? Or at least the law says. So for example, when it was being argued about the Army Act, for instance, right? That, but it doesn't apply to civilians. But in practice, we know that they are being targeted right?
Yeah.
So you can write whatever you want in the law, but we know that practice is different. So similarly with PICA, let's say for instance section 20, which we call the criminal defamation section, only a natural person could be a complainant, right? So you can't have a state institution, but a plethora of cases were those that the state registered, despite the language of the law not allowing it. What happened? Those cases went through, then there were challenges, then the High Court ruling, but that happened over several years after the damage was already done. And this is what's going to happen in all these scenarios, where you can have certain things. And the problem is not only the fact that laws get abused. There are explicit provisions being written into these laws that actually negate a lot of the protections. And a lot of these, including e-safety, says access to data or call for information. And that is very vague. Now, what business does let's say, a content regulatory authority, so to speak, as they are presenting it, have to do with data? To ask companies, and in that own very vague broad grounds. Again, when we're talking about the Official Secrets Act, we don't know which the approved version is, but the critique of this has been that you've expanded these powers, you've taken away warrants, anybody can arrest. Then the PEMRA Act, disinformation, if you don't reach out for a comment, and what if you're denied the comment or your access is blocked, or who's going to decide whether you gave adequate coverage or not? It is extremely, is adequate coverage a ticker? Is it a whole column? Is it, a program? How do we know, and who's going to decide?
So, what you're describing is pretty draconian. What I'm surprised about is how come there is not enough noise about it?
To be honest, I think this is also outpacing us, the speed at which this is happening. To even go through the laws, often the criticism will be, but that's not really in the law, right? But how will we know what's in the law if we don't make it public in the first place, right? And this is one of the techniques that often the government uses, right? But this is the old version, but you never gave us the new version, right? And these are sort of these old techniques. But again, I think it's also, unfortunately, we've seen this disintegration happen over a period of years, right? Where you've broken down your civil society, you've broken down your NGO sector also, or whatever capacity that existed, stands depleted. Even the groups, and unfortunately, I think some of it is we were operating under the assumption that post vote of no confidence, democracy was restored to the country, and the hybrid system had suddenly overnight come to an end. So I think some are still sort of, we've been critics of the PTI government, but again, that doesn't mean that when it's somebody you may seem to like or favor over the other or the previous dispensation, that you're not going to hold them to account. So what this government is doing is going to have such severe consequences, because once a law is introduced, this is going to be very reverse, and courts are not going to strike every piece of legislation down.
So we saw in the last few days some parliamentarians begrudgingly expressing their disappointment with the legislation, especially when it came to the Official Secrets Act, right? And then we saw civil society organizations like bar councils, Women Action Forum, Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, newspapers writing editorial about it, because they could see, the security agencies were being given sweeping powers to arrest people, to conduct raids, to take away your laptops and all that. But when it comes to digital, censorship and regulation, is it your sense that the understanding is limited in that generation of human rights activists and lawyers? They don't quite comprehend how this is going to restrict our freedoms?
I think, yes, it is fairly technical also, they seem to think. And of course, some part of it is technical. But there are broad areas that you can see overlap with fundamental rights. For example, privacy, right? So if you're waiving warrants or if you're providing direct government access, let's say even in the data protection bill, the commission can facilitate government access to sensitive personal data. That's a red flag right there. There's no technicality you need to understand to see how problematic the something like that is, for that matter, if you're replicating the PEMRA model now for the internet, you have experience over the last few years at least to know how this gets abused. And it has been abused, will be abused. So there should be a clear red flag when you're reading. I suppose it's also, we're being bombarded with so many.
So, I mean, look, I don't think all political parties are the same, or all political leaders are the same, or all legislators are the same. But are you disappointed with some of these legislators who we like to think have some conscience and some commitment to democratic values, that they've been pretty much silent? They're falling in line. They don't want to upset their respective parties by openly speaking out against some of these laws.
Absolutely. And while you have the usual lone voices still, but those are far too few. And they've not been able to stem the tide against the party policy. That has not changed. And this duplicity when you're in opposition and you are making certain commitments. And the fact is, Shahzeb, the thing is that it's, again, with the PMLN, this just happened to them. Everything they're introducing is something that they went through.
They suffered, by their own legislation, which they had passed.
And they're repeating it.
And yet they're doing it again.
And who's going to suffer more? It's the dissident who will hold power to account irrespective of the face that's in, sort of the front of power, right? So it doesn't matter which party, but those who consistently will stand for principle are the ones who are going to suffer. The political parties will always be in the game to come back to power. They will always make these compromises, and they do, right? They also have leading lawyers and resources and visibility to argue their cases. But not every journalist, not every activist, not every dissident has that. They're the ones who are to courts and trying to get pro bono help and trying to get some visibility in their cases, and it doesn't happen for everybody. And they're the ones who are labeled as anti Pakistan and agents, and employability is affected. These are the real hard material facts that they don't have to contend with.
So I guess no sympathy there for people who are experienced, who have suffered, and yet they are silent, and they are allowing all this to happen and not speaking up when it matters, because it won't really make much of a difference once these laws are passed. And these sweeping powers are given to the authorities. It won't make much of a difference.
And they are complicit in this. That's what it is.
But thank you very much for explaining some of these points. I guess I will say that the pushback we've seen on the Official Secrets Act gives me some hope that there are people who are aware in the legal profession and across the country who are looking at this. We need to debate this. This is our right. We need to debate the merits and demerits of some of these laws, and we will continue the conversation, come what may. Thank you so much for joining us on Dawn News English. We will hopefully be talking to you again.